That night, the room vibrated with the conversations and laughter of old friends. The atmosphere was light, almost intoxicating, full of shared stories, complicit smiles and secrets that the surface of their gazes hid. I watched everyone around me with a glass of whiskey in one hand and the raw, cutting truth in the other. Of all the secrets kept in that room, mine was the sharpest. My wife was there, smiling and greeting everyone as if everything was in place. Her gestures were elegant, as always, but at that moment they seemed too calculated, too rehearsed. I knew that this party would be the last we would attend as husband and wife, and she didn't even suspect it. The moment was meticulously planned. I wanted it to be a shock, an earthquake of words that would rock her world and reorganize it at once. "I'm getting a divorce," I said, my voice firm, dry. The room fell silent instantly, and all eyes converged on us. She looked at me, confused, not knowing if this was a bad joke or a sincere confession. When I added the reason, her expression changed. "I'm divorcing you because I found out everything," I said, and in that instant, her world shattered into 1,000 pieces. It wasn't an accident or a coincidence. I discovered every detail of what she was keeping hidden. For months, I had felt something different, but I insisted on rationalizing everything. I let the doubts pile up, ignoring every warning sign, until a string of messages on her cell phone made me see what I had already feared. It was eating me up. I wanted to confront her, to ask for explanations, to try to understand how someone who seemed to love me so much could maintain a double life with such coldness. But instead, I chose silence. And in the silence, I began to investigate. If a marriage is built on trust, I knew that ours was crumbling with every lie I discovered, with every evasive excuse she offered me. And yet I kept quiet, cultivating pain and anger as if they were the only things keeping me going. The days turned into a game of false normality as I discreetly followed in her footsteps. I hired a detective, and what he revealed was devastating: hidden meetings, candlelit dinners I didn't know existed, and smiles that weren't for me. Every time I saw a new piece of evidence, my chest burned. Every image, every receipt kept as evidence was a piece of our past that she tore up without hesitation. I spent sleepless nights wondering what I would say, what I would do. And when I finally decided, I planned every detail of that moment of exposure. She, so calm and confident, had no idea what awaited her at that party. In the days leading up to that night, our conversations were brief, routine. I watched her with a mixture of contempt and curiosity, trying to understand how she managed to keep up that theater, how she managed to feign love while secretly sharing her life with another man. Silently, I began to question every memory we had together. Was it all just a farce? Our trips, our birthdays, all the shared plans. Were they real or just an act by a woman who lived in deception? And while I watched her so immersed in her own performance, I began to prepare my own. The night of the party had been carefully planned. I wanted it to be in the middle of our friends, in an environment where she couldn't hide or escape. It was there that I would strip her bare, that I would tear off the mask for everyone to see what was behind that smile. I imagined the shock on her face, the terror in her eyes when she saw that the secret was finally falling apart. "I know everything," I added, and the impact of my words made her flinch. She looked around, desperately searching for an answer, but there were no excuses that could undo what I already knew. "I know what you've been doing. I know who the man is, where you are, and everything else." My voice carried all the hurt, all the contempt of months of silence, and the humiliation I felt now was hers. Her lips trembled, and she tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Everyone present looked at us, and the discomfort in the room was palpable. She was finally feeling the exposure, the shame that I had carried in silence. Her pain was now a reflection of mine, and I wanted her to feel every second, to live every moment with the same intensity that I had felt. Because now, in that instant, she was exposed, naked in her betrayal, without being able to defend herself or seek any justification. The consequences of that revelation were immediate. Close friends, people who had known us forever, began to look at her with looks of disapproval and questioning. She tried to defend herself, to say she was sorry, but I wouldn't let her go on. Every word she tried to utter seemed empty, as if even her apologies were an extension of the lie. And then, just when it seemed that nothing else could happen, just when she believed that her life couldn't fall apart any further, the revelations about her lover emerged. In an unexpected twist, I discovered that the man she had cheated on me with was not just a stranger, but someone with a dubious past, someone who would do even more damage to her reputation. My wife, who had once seemed so perfect and untouchable, now found herself caught in a web of lies, consequences and regrets. She tried desperately to save what little remained of her dignity, but each new discovery sank her deeper and deeper. Because, after all, she hadn't just betrayed her husband, she had also betrayed herself, the people who loved her, the friends who trusted her. And as all this unfolded, she slowly realized that her lover, the man she had risked everything for, would not be by her side in the aftermath. He, who had encouraged her to cheat, who had taken advantage of her insecurities and desires, disappeared when she needed him most. She found herself abandoned, unprotected, and for the first time confronted with the reality of her choices. But what perhaps devastated her most was seeing that the man she had betrayed, the one she had sworn to love, was now in a position of strength and justice. I watched her slowly crumble, and instead of offering consolation, I moved further away, letting her feel the weight of every lie, every deception, every broken promise. With each passing day, I saw the effects of my actions on her life. She had lost everything she once believed she had, the love of her children, the trust of her friends, and even her self-respect. Now she was facing the harsh reality of the consequences she herself had chosen. And, deep down, she knew that I would never look at her the same way again, that our history was marked by betrayal and pain, and that, no matter how hard she tried, nothing could undo what had been revealed. In the end, she realized that she had exchanged stability for desire, true love for a passing illusion. And as she found herself alone, isolated and destroyed, she finally understood the price of her choices. I left her there, in that abyss of regret and despair, and moved on, rebuilding what was left of my life. But even today, I wonder, did she really regret it? Did she ever really love anyone, amidst all the lies and manipulation? Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal will never be glorified or romanticized. The stories you'll hear are fictional, created to show the devastating impact that disloyalty has on people's lives. Get ready for an intense narrative full of twists and turns. Fasten your seatbelts and get ready for a story that will stir your emotions and leave you breathless. Good story. The Boston environment always seemed so familiar to Thomas and Emily. The couple had been together for more than a decade and, in everyone's eyes, they were an exemplary pair, he, a renowned lawyer, firm in his convictions and always seeking a balance between work and personal life, she, the owner of an admirable kindness, dedicated to her family and the social projects she was involved in. From his earliest years, Thomas had always been the pillar of the family, someone whose strength and stability gave Emily security. She, in turn, radiated a lightness that became essential to him in the midst of the rigidity and discipline of his profession. This complementarity, which seemed perfect, was envied by friends and respected by colleagues. The two met when they were young, at a university party at Harvard, where Thomas was studying law. He, with his strong features and serious posture, contrasted with Emily, an outgoing art student with a warm smile that attracted everyone around her. That evening was marked by an unexpected and perhaps unforgettable encounter. Emily approached Thomas without any hesitation, enchanted by the depth she saw in his eyes. The conversation flowed naturally and he, who had always been restrained, found himself laughing and at ease like never before. The attraction was immediate and, from then on, their lives took a new direction. Their relationship, which started off unpretentious, soon became intense and, soon after, inseparable. Thomas found himself enchanted by Emily's free spirit, by the way she saw the world, always looking for the beautiful in the little things. Emily, for her part, admired Thomas's seriousness and loyalty, characteristics that brought a stability she sometimes felt she needed. When they married, the feeling was that they had found home in each other. Thomas liked to believe that this union completed them completely. He often said that Emily was his covenant with life, a silent promise that, together, they could face anything. Over the years, life began to shape itself to their dreams and ambitions. Thomas achieved success in his career, gaining respect and recognition, while Emily dedicated herself to artistic projects and eventually began organizing cultural events around the city, where she made many contacts and friends. Despite having very different personalities, they always found a balance in their coexistence. Thomas liked his life organized, with predictable schedules and routine, while Emily was the opposite, moving on the spur of the moment, guided by intuition. This difference, which for many could be a hindrance, was precisely what made them work so well together. The house they chose to live in, an old, spacious building surrounded by trees, reflected this meeting of opposite worlds. Thomas loved the office, where books and documents occupied carefully organized shelves. Emily, on the other hand, had turned one of the bedrooms into her painting studio, a space that was always disorganized, full of paints and brushes scattered around. That house was the couple's refuge, the place where they built a home and where so many memories were created. Over time, the natural challenges of living together, expectations and the different directions their professional lives took emerged. Thomas delved deeper into the legal world, while Emily expanded her network of friends, attending meetings and cultural events that he had often avoided. The routine became less shared. Thomas spent evenings concentrating on complicated cases, while Emily sometimes arrived late after events or meetings. But despite the subtle distances that formed, mutual trust seemed unshakable. However, Emily began to feel something she couldn't exactly describe. In the midst of Thomas's success and recognition, and with him often traveling to see clients out of town, Emily found herself questioning her own role in the relationship. She was proud of her husband, of course, but at the same time, a certain emptiness seemed to haunt her at times. Those moments shared so intensely at the beginning of the relationship began to become sparse, as if each of them were gradually building a separate world. Emily, although involved in her projects, missed the attention and presence of Thomas, who had previously seemed so dedicated to being by her side in every detail. It was in these moments of loneliness that Emily sought comfort in her social activities and her group of friends. Going out became a kind of escape valve, a space where she felt she could be who she was, without the weight of expectations or the need to live up to something. Thomas, although he noticed this change in Emily, interpreted the situation as a phase. He believed that ups and downs were natural in a long marriage, and that eventually they would go back to the way they were before. However, the increasingly demanding work began to consume much of his energy and attention. He longed for recognition, financial security, and the certainty that he was building a solid future for both of them. There was a silent pride in knowing that his sleepless nights, sacrifices and pressure were worth it, because Emily could live without worries. He didn't know, however, that what she really wanted was something much simpler, the time and the gaze that he seemed to have forgotten. Thomas hadn't yet realized how the life he was building was taking him away from what had once united them. And Emily, for her part, began to question more and more whether the love they felt could withstand the weight of routine and the silence that was gradually taking the place of conversations and looks of complicity. Deep down, she knew that he loved her. He had always been devoted, present in the way he believed was most important. However, there was something in her heart that began to yearn for more, a silent desire that made her lose herself in thought as she gazed out of the window of the art studio she loved so much. At a certain point, Emily began to wonder if the life they were leading was the only possible form of happiness. The questions arose in her mind almost involuntarily, and she found herself wondering what it would be like if fate had taken a different course, if they had made different choices. Deep down, she wanted to share these thoughts with Thomas, but every time she tried, he was too busy to listen. The sparkle in his eyes, which had once been devoted to her, now seemed to be reserved only for work. And so the couple went on, each with their own silences, doubts and interpretations of what it meant to be happy. Thomas believed that security and stability were the key to everything, while Emily longed for spontaneity, surprise, and the human touch that, for her, was the essence of being together. Every smile they shared at events, every gesture of public affection, masked the growing distance that only the two of them could perceive, but which they still didn't have the courage to confront. However, there was something about Thomas that bothered him, a restlessness he couldn't define. It was as if a shadow loomed over his thoughts, but he pushed it away, telling himself that everything was fine. Over time, he had learned to hide his weaknesses, to ignore his doubts, always putting her well-being and the couple's financial security first. He refused to believe that this bond could be shaken by any difficulty. Emily, on the other hand, let herself be enveloped by the possibilities, the meetings and events she attended. The freedom she experienced in these environments was a relief from what she considered Thomas's rigidity. Not that she wanted to change her life completely, but there was an unresolved longing growing inside her, something she herself feared to understand. And so it was that, in the midst of these confused feelings, Thomas and Emily's relationship became a silent dance. A dance in which every step represented an attempt to find each other, to recover what they had lost, but without knowing how. Every gesture, every conversation that didn't happen, was another step towards the unknown. They both carried the love they felt for each other, but that love was no longer enough to erase the shadow that was growing between them. Perhaps neither of them knew it, but life as they knew it was about to change. Thomas was beginning to realize how much the world around him had changed. In a relationship that had always been based on trust, he now found himself questioning small gestures and looks from his wife. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there was something that bothered him. Every night that Emily went out to the events she organized, Thomas felt the weight of a different absence. The frequency with which she was away increased, and the excuses were always the same: professional commitments, friends, cultural meetings. He had never been one to question or control his wife's outings, he had always trusted her completely. But now, when she left the house, he felt a doubt eating away at him, a mistrust that didn't fit with who he believed himself to be. Thomas and Emily's marriage, once unbeatable, began to seem to him like a fragile construction, a structure that threatened to collapse with each new night when she didn't return at the agreed time, or when an unexpected message made her get out of bed and reply briefly, almost mechanically. He tried to understand what was happening, telling himself that the changes were natural, that perhaps she was just going through a new phase. But the more he tried to rationalize, the more the feeling of loss of control grew. One evening, after a week in which they had barely spoken, Thomas decided to surprise Emily. He arranged to leave the office early, something he rarely did, and bought her a wine she liked. He planned to wait for her at home, hoping that the surprise would rekindle something he felt had been lost. He wanted to see the sparkle in her eyes again, the same one that had enchanted him from the first days. When Emily arrived, however, the reception was not as he had imagined. She seemed surprised, but not in the way he had expected. There was something in her eyes that made him feel like an intruder in his own home, as if, in preparing for that moment, he had broken through an invisible barrier. She hugged him briefly, disconcerted, and quickly began to say that she was exhausted, that she'd had a tiring day and would rather get some rest. Thomas insisted that they have at least one glass of wine together, but noticed that she was distant, just playing the role of wife. Throughout that evening, while she feigned a distant interest, Thomas felt the weight of loneliness. He tried to remember the moments of complicity, the time when she smiled spontaneously, but what he saw now was only emptiness. Something felt wrong, and he couldn't ignore it. The days passed, and Thomas's sense of unease only grew. He noticed that Emily was becoming more and more evasive, less and less present, and no matter how hard he tried to initiate conversations, she closed herself off in monosyllables. That's when he began to notice certain details, such as messages that she answered quickly and nervously, or the discreet but different perfume that sometimes lingered on her clothes when she returned home. He wanted to confront her, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the fear of hearing a truth he wasn't yet ready to accept. Finally, in an impulse that went against everything he believed himself to be, Thomas decided to seek answers quietly. One afternoon at work, during a coffee break, he contacted a private detective. A sense of guilt overtook him. He had always sworn to trust Emily, had believed that they were invulnerable to the wear and tear that other couples faced. But there he was, hiring a stranger to investigate his own wife. Shame gnawed at him, but his desire for answers was stronger. While waiting for information from the detective, Thomas tried to continue his routine. In the office, he pretended to be focused, but his mind was elsewhere, occupied with the assumptions and doubts that plagued him. The days passed slowly until, one afternoon, the detective contacted him, informing him that he needed to see him to discuss something important. When Thomas entered the detective's office, he felt the weight of uncertainty. The man in front of him maintained a serious expression, handing him an envelope with disturbing calm. With trembling hands, Thomas opened the envelope, revealing photographs and records of Emily's places and meetings. The images were clear, undeniable. She was with another man. In all the photos, she seemed involved, smiling in a way that Thomas hadn't seen for years. That discovery was like a punch. The ground disappeared beneath his feet, and he was stunned, unresponsive, trying to process the truth. The man next to Emily in the photos was someone he recognized from social events she organized. One of her friends from her circle, a person he had greeted politely many times, without ever suspecting a thing. Seeing the images was like receiving cruel confirmation of something he tried to deny. For the next few days, Thomas lived between denial and bitter acceptance. He hadn't confronted Emily yet, he didn't know how, nor did he want to hear an explanation. Every detail of what he had seen in the photos replayed in his mind like a horror movie. Her laughing, touching the man's arm intimately, the two of them at a candlelit dinner. It was a sight he would never forget. He felt betrayed, humiliated but, above all, crushed by the pain of seeing the woman he loved involved with someone else. Even so, Thomas didn't let Emily notice anything. He continued to act as coldly as she seemed to, waiting for the right moment to confront her. He wanted to understand what had happened, what had led her to seek something outside of marriage. He wanted to hear from her, to see if she would at least have the courage to face up to what she had done. One night when Emily came home late, Thomas was up waiting for her. She entered the house, surprised to see him still on the sofa, and, for the first time in a long time, he didn't disguise the hard look on his face, the mixture of disappointment and anger that took over his expression. She hesitated, sensing that something was wrong, but tried to act naturally, as if nothing could shake her. Thomas stood up slowly, the words almost choking in his throat. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but fraught with tension. Emily tried to look away, but he held her by the arm, forcing her to face him. "I know what you've been doing," he continued, and the silence in the room became unbearable. She tried to speak, but he held up his hand, asking for silence. He opened the envelope in front of her, the photographs sliding across the table. Emily's reaction was immediate, her eyes widened and her previously relaxed body stiffened, as if the whole act had fallen apart. She looked at him with despair, a guilt that she tried unsuccessfully to hide. Thomas felt his chest tighten at the sight of her expression of regret, but at the same time, he knew that nothing could ease the pain he felt. The betrayal was there, wide open between them, like an exposed wound, impossible to ignore. Emily tried to mumble apologies, to explain that it was a mistake, that she hadn't wanted things to come to this. But Thomas was unfazed. He didn't want to hear any excuses, not at that moment. What he wanted was the naked truth, without the masks she had worn for so long. She cringed, tears starting to flow, but he remained firm, showing no compassion. And so, between bitter words and a deafening silence, the betrayal finally came to light, revealing the fragility of a marriage that, for years, Thomas had believed to be solid. Emily remained silent after her failed attempt to justify what she had done, while he, still in shock, struggled to control the anger and pain that threatened to overflow. The end of that chapter was clear to both of them, but something still hung in the air, an undisclosed secret, something that Emily kept hidden, something that, Thomas knew, would change the way he saw the whole story even more. And at that moment, even without fully understanding what was to come, he felt that the night held more revelations than he could imagine. The room was plunged into a dense, awkward silence. Thomas stared at Emily, who could barely hold his gaze. The photos on the table were like incontrovertible evidence, physical proof that the world he had built and defended was crumbling. Emily tried to find the right words, but each attempt died before fully forming in her mind. Finally, after a long, tense silence, Emily broke the invisible barrier separating them with a hesitant whisper, I'm sorry, Thomas. I never meant it to be like this. Her voice was a trembling thread of regret and despair, but Thomas, his face expressionless, just shook his head, as if the apology didn't carry any weight in the face of the reality they were both facing. You didn't want it to be like this? Then how did you want it to be, Emily? Thomas replied, his voice controlled but with a sharp edge that cut through the air. Did you want to hide it forever? Live a lie until when? Emily lowered her head, and her eyes began to glisten with restrained tears. Thomas, I know it seems unforgivable. But you have to understand, I felt alone. You were always so busy, so focused on work. I just wanted attention. Thomas took a step back, as if her words were something toxic he didn't want to inhale. Attention? Is that what you wanted? And you decided that the only way to get it was to betray our marriage? Our home? I work, Emily, I fight every day to ensure our future, so that we never lack anything. And you think that makes me guilty? Emily, overcome by a mixture of shame and frustration, lifted her face, her eyes now filled with a firmness Thomas had never seen before. Do you really believe that it's all about money, Thomas? That all I needed was financial security? It's not just that, and you know it. Thomas felt a tightening in his chest. Every word that came out of Emily's mouth seemed to rewrite their history, as if he had spent years in an illusion, unable to see what was really going on. He, who had always believed he was doing the best for her, realized that his efforts had perhaps never been enough. But he still couldn't conceive that this maladjustment, however great, justified what she had done. So tell me, Emily, he murmured, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the table, tell me how it came to this. Because all I see now is a marriage destroyed by lies. Emily remained silent, as if she was searching for the courage to say something she hadn't yet revealed. She took a deep breath and, with a shaky voice, finally confessed, there's something else you need to know. Something I've kept for a long time. Thomas watched her, confused and alert. What else could there be? He had already discovered the affair, had already felt the betrayal take root in his chest. What else could she have been hiding? There's something I never told you, because I was afraid of how it might change everything, she began, hesitantly. It wasn't just about loneliness, Thomas. It was deeper than that. The man with whom you saw me, he's more than just a lover. He's someone who's been present in my life for years. Thomas's expression hardened. What do you mean, Emily? Who is he really? Emily closed her eyes, gathering the courage to tell the truth she had kept buried. He's your best friend's father. And, yes, he's married. I knew you might find out about the betrayal, but this detail, this secret. I kept it hidden for so long because I knew you would never forgive me. Thomas felt the ground disappear from under his feet. He had always respected his best friend's father, a man he imagined to be upright and trustworthy. The revelation hit him with an intensity he hadn't imagined possible. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a web of lies that went beyond their marriage, something that involved even their deepest friendships and bonds. How could you? Thomas's words came out with difficulty, each one laden with a pain he couldn't hide. You involved one of the people closest to me in this. You destroyed not only our marriage, but also the trust one had in everyone around us. You both deceived me in a way that I'll never understand." Emily began to cry, tears that expressed the guilt and despair that had accompanied her ever since she had started this affair. "I know that nothing I say now can make you understand. I know that this hurts you in a way that I may never be able to repair. But I was lost, Thomas. It's no excuse, I know, but it's the truth. I got involved in a way I never wanted to. I thought he filled something that was missing in me, but the truth is that I was only sinking deeper and deeper." Thomas pulled away, as if contact with her was unbearable. He felt a mixture of hatred and sadness, a pain so deep that it seemed to tear at his soul. "And you think I'm going to be able to understand that? That I'm just going to accept that you, the person I trusted the most, decided to destroy me like that?" Emily tried to take a step towards him, but Thomas held up his hand, interrupting her. "No. There's nothing more to explain, Emily. There are no more excuses that can make this seem less devastating than it is. You've destroyed everything, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to recover from it." He picked up his keys, anger and sadness turning into grim determination. Without looking back, Thomas left the house, leaving Emily alone with the consequences of her choices, with the guilt and remorse that she knew would follow her forever. The door closed with a heavy sound, echoing in the empty house. Emily let herself fall to the floor, uncontrollable crying filling the space where there had once been love, complicity, and shared dreams. After Thomas left, a heavy silence hung over what had once been a home. Emily stood there, alone, feeling the coldness of her own actions. The sound of the door closing echoed in her mind like a final blow. It was as if that sound had sealed not only Thomas's departure, but also any possibility of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of returning to the past. The house, once full of life and shared laughter, was now a reflection of her own loneliness. All she could see around her were memories of the choices she had made and the consequences she had never imagined having to face so brutally. That night, the loneliness seemed even more unbearable. Every corner of the house carried memories of the times when they had been happy together, before the lies, before the distance. Emily tried to remember when exactly their marriage had started to fall apart, but she couldn't find an answer. She wondered if it had always been like this and she just hadn't noticed. Perhaps she was blinded by the yearning for something new, something that would make her feel alive in a way that Thomas, with his predictable routine, could no longer provide. While Emily tried to make sense of her own choices, Thomas drove aimlessly through the city, his thoughts filled with pain and fury. He wanted to confront the man who had destroyed his trust, who had taken advantage of his wife's vulnerability and who, above all, had betrayed their friendship with a coldness that Thomas had never expected. Emily's words about the affair still echoed in his mind. He wondered how far the lies had taken root, how many times he had been deceived while believing he was living on a solid foundation. Thomas parked the car in a park where they used to walk in the early years of their marriage. The nostalgia of the place brought an even deeper wave of sadness, mixed with a sense of loss and betrayal. He sat on a wooden bench, looking at the emptiness around him and wondering if he would ever be able to forgive her. He knew he needed to process everything, but the intensity of his emotions prevented him from organizing his thoughts. Every happy memory was now distorted, tainted by the discovery that the woman he loved so much was capable of such betrayal. Meanwhile, Emily was desperately trying to understand how she had gotten there. She looked at her phone, considering calling Thomas, saying something that might bring a modicum of relief to both of them, but she couldn't find the words to undo the damage. The weight of remorse suffocated her, and she knew that there was no excuse, no argument, that could erase what she had done. The emptiness in her chest was now filled with a pain that she herself had caused, a suffering that only her choices had built up. The following days were a whirlwind of contradictory emotions. Thomas avoided all contact with her. He didn't reply to her messages and ignored her calls, which increased Emily's despair. She longed for a chance to explain herself, for a moment in which she could explain her motives, even though she knew she might not be understood. Thomas's absence was like a constant echo of her own guilt, and she found herself facing the possibility of having lost the man she had loved most in her life. In the midst of mourning his marriage, Thomas began to reflect on his own role in the crisis they were facing. He knew that he had dedicated a large part of his life to his work, that he had distanced himself at crucial moments, and that his thirst to build financial security for both of them had made him lose sight of what really mattered. Emily's betrayal was unbearable, but the question on his mind now was, had he somehow contributed to the void she had tried to fill? These thoughts began to consume Thomas, who found himself trapped in a complex moral dilemma. The desire to confront his best friend's father was still intense, but reflection on his own actions and omissions forced him into painful introspection. He knew that the resentment he harbored couldn't be erased, but something inside him also reminded him of the promises he had made to Emily, of the times they had been together, united in a love he believed to be unbreakable. Emily, for her part, was plunged into a loneliness that seemed endless. Without Thomas around, she realized how much he really meant to her. Everything she had once thought of as security now seemed vague and empty. Thomas's presence, the way he made her feel protected, and the solid relationship they had built up over the years had been lost because of her own inability to deal with dissatisfaction in a mature way. Now, all that remained was the bitterness of knowing that she might never be able to mend what she had broken. The days turned into weeks, and the pain for both of them deepened. Emily, finally recognizing the gravity of her actions, decided to write Thomas a letter. It was her last attempt to achieve something close to forgiveness, or at least to explain herself in a way that might ease his suffering. She knew he was under no obligation to read the letter, but she still felt compelled to try. The letter was an open confession, a sincere attempt to expose her feelings and admit her responsibility. She described the loneliness she had felt over the years, the times when she felt Thomas was physically present but emotionally distant. She explained that the betrayal had not been an act of revenge, but a desperate escape from frustration and self-doubt. However, she also acknowledged that this choice had been hers, and hers alone, and that any hurt caused to Thomas was her responsibility alone. Thomas received the letter on a cold evening when he got home. He hesitated before opening the envelope, fearful of finding more reasons for resentment. But curiosity and the desire to better understand Emily's motivations drove him to read every word. As he read, he felt a mixture of emotions, anger, sadness, empathy. He saw in her words the reflection of his own guilt, of the moments when, perhaps, he could have been more present. Emily's letter, although sincere, didn't ease the pain he felt. It did, however, bring a perspective he hadn't been able to see before. Thomas realized that, although he could never accept the betrayal, there was also something he needed to confront within himself. The love he still felt for her, even though he was wounded, demanded greater clarity about his own shortcomings. He didn't know if he could forgive her, but he felt he needed to make a decision about their future. The next day, Thomas decided to meet Emily for a final chat. The meeting was arranged in a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes and the tension of the house they had once shared. When he saw Emily, he noticed the weariness on her face, her downcast eyes and the expression of guilt that seemed to be carved into her features. She was waiting for him, restless, with a mixture of fear and hope. Thomas sat down in front of her and began to speak directly. "I read your letter, Emily. I've read it and tried to understand what you've been through, what led you to all this. I won't say that I understand completely, because what you did is still unbearable for me. But, the truth is that I also saw myself in some of the moments you described. I distanced myself, lost myself in the idea that I was doing what was best for both of us without realizing what was really happening between us." Emily looked up, surprised by Thomas's confession. She hadn't expected him to admit his share of the blame for that failure. "Thomas, I never wanted it to come to this. I was weak, and I made mistakes that I can never undo. But if you can at least understand a part of what I felt, I'll feel a little less guilty." Thomas nodded, but the look of sadness on his face showed that her words weren't enough to make amends for what had happened. "Emily, what you did destroyed me. Every day I spent by your side, building a life together, was broken by your choice. I don't know if I can forgive you, but I think we need to decide where we go from here. Because the way it is, I can't go on. Emily held his hands, seeking courage in his touch. I know there's nothing I can do to fix this, but please, if you can, at least try to remember what we were before all this. I just wanted one last chance to show you that, despite my mistakes, I still love you and always have. The silence between them was broken by the sound of distant voices in the cafe. Thomas, lost in thought, tried to weigh up what remained of their history together. He knew that this meeting was crucial, the last chance to decide the course of their lives. Silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken words and broken memories. After their meeting in the cafe, both Thomas and Emily knew that this would be the final decision, the point of no return. It was as if they were both standing on the edge of an abyss, where one step in any direction could decide the future of their lives. Thomas, his gaze still hardened, finally let his mind go down a path he had so far avoided, that of a life without her. Over the next few days, the decision was inevitable. Thomas distanced himself completely, making it clear that there was no longer any room for reconciliation. He could no longer see Emily as he had before, and every happy memory that surfaced now brought with it a corrosive hurt. Thomas moved on, determined to get his life back on track and rediscover himself away from the shadow of betrayal that weighed on him. He turned to friends for help and, although it took him a while to trust again, he found support in those who genuinely cared. Getting his life back on track was a slow process, but he began to rebuild, with steady steps, the image of himself as someone who had overcome the worst. Emily, however, couldn't move on with the same ease. Thomas's absence was like a wound she couldn't heal. Every day, every empty space at home, reminded her of the irreparable flaw, the choice that took her away from the man she loved. And life without him, without the support and affection that Thomas had always given her, was a torment. Emily tried to rebuild her routine, but the loneliness was relentless. Her friends drifted away, her family watched her with discreet suspicion, and the man who had involved her in the betrayal had also disappeared, leaving her even more isolated. It was as if the world itself was judging her, leaving her trapped in a cycle of regret. Eventually, Thomas and Emily had to face the formal closure of their marriage in court. The atmosphere between them was cold and distant, but at the end, Thomas looked her in the eye with a weight that she understood perfectly. He didn't need to say anything, the look in his eyes already expressed everything he felt. Without another word, he left, and that silent farewell marked the definitive end of a story that she knew she could never relive. After the divorce, Thomas continued to rebuild his life. He invested in work, but this time he also allowed himself moments of lightness, travel and the rediscovery of hobbies that he had long put aside. The wound of betrayal still hurt, but it was gradually turning into a scar that reminded him not of suffering, but of overcoming. He came to value truth and integrity even more, and although he hesitated to open up to a new love, he believed that one day he could allow himself to do so. Thomas hadn't let bitterness consume him, he felt free, wiser and ready to start again. Emily, on the other hand, lived under the weight of regret. The decision to betray, the involvement with someone so close to Thomas's circle of trust, and the coldness with which she had hidden it all, none of it could be erased from her conscience. The days were long and monotonous, and she sank deeper and deeper into the loneliness of a house that once housed love and life. Memories were her only comfort, but at the same time her greatest punishment, a constant reminder of everything she had lost. And unlike Thomas, who was gradually finding peace again, Emily found herself trapped in a life without purpose, without support and, above all, without the hope of recovering what she had destroyed. Their fates unfolded in a tragic yet just way. Thomas had his redemption, he rebuilt himself from the pain and, in doing so, gained a new perspective on life. He learned to value the little moments more, to prioritize what really mattered and, above all, to never lose himself in the name of supposed security. He was now a renewed man, and the trauma of the past, although present, no longer defined who he was. Emily, for her part, faced the consequences of her betrayal with loneliness as her companion. The pain of loss, the emptiness of regret and the lack of support became constant, a daily reminder of what she had lost through selfish decisions. Without Thomas, she found herself lost, unable to get her life back on track, and every day was a silent penance for the mistake she had made. The end for both of them was marked by the justice of the consequences of their actions. Thomas managed to move on, turning his pain into strength, and Emily, although repentant, was unable to escape the weight of her choices. It was the end of a story that, although tragic, taught them both the deepest lessons about love, loyalty and the power of choices. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below telling us what you thought and your opinion of the characters' journeys. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Remember that this channel does not support betrayal under any circumstances. Our stories are just a reflection on the consequences of wrong choices.